send the microphone over to Ms. Keys Gamara to tee off this next portion of the work session.
Are our presenters ready?
We are ready.
Okay. Let it fly.
All right. Well, good afternoon, everyone. I think actually that this is great to have this work session on this day because you've been dealing with some really weighty topics all related to equity, and this topic is also related to equity. So I do think it's good to cover this today. I'm going to try to go through the background information pretty quickly. If you have questions, I'm certainly happy to answer those after the presentation. But the main objectives or outcomes for today's meeting are listed here. And the first is to provide some of the background information that the board had requested on really the current state of our advanced academic programs with regard to equity. The second piece is really the most important piece of this particular work session, which is for the board to have an opportunity to discuss and hopefully finalize the major requirements or the major elements of the external review of our advanced academic program identification practices with an equity lens. So to start that conversation, I do want to refer us back to the origin of this discussion when the board in December of 2018 developed the following consensus statement that's represented on this slide regarding the work that you would like the school system to do. So there's a few key elements that I just want to highlight on this particular slide. The first, obviously, is to examine our AAP program with the goal of eliminating gaps in opportunity, access, and achievement for our subgroups. You asked for an inventory of recommendations that have been made in the past, as well as an opportunity to look at our immersion programs as well as AAP programs. And you asked for an external review that would focus on best practices, research-based best practices for achieving equity, and the input from experts in the field as well as a variety of stakeholder groups, and then actions that could be taken both in the short term or the immediate and in the long term. So this was the consensus that was reached. And today what we want to do is try to flesh this out a little bit more to figure out what are the major elements that need to be required in an external scope of review or a contract. And similar to the discussion that the board was just having about what would an outside consultant do regarding boundaries, what I would like to do is get a sense of the major requirements that you would like this external consultant to do, work with the Office of Procurement Services to develop basically a draft contract that the board could review before we would execute it. So it's not like you have to reach 100% consensus today. You would have additional opportunities to review that before we would execute a contract. So with that being said, this is just an outline of some of the background that we want to cover today in terms of state requirements, some of the existing gaps in our equity data, and then a proposal of areas of focus for the external review. So we've linked here the VDOE requirements, the state requirements for gifted and talented programs. And I do want to highlight first the state definition for gifted services. And you see in red that the state definition requires us to identify students that have the potential for higher levels of accomplishment when compared to others of the same age, experience, or environment. So sometimes people in the community think that we're just identifying and servicing students that have already demonstrated the aptitude. And that's not true. We're looking for students that could demonstrate that aptitude and are demonstrating the potential to do so. There's another slide that lists some of the major elements, state requirements, and I'm not going to go through these in detail. The one thing that I would point out is that the screening process definitely has to include more than one factor. It needs to include multiple criteria, and it does need to include referrals from parents, guardians, teachers, or self-referrals from students. So there's a lot of state requirements that kind of get to the equity of services that the board has been talking about. In the forum, the board had also asked for some information about equity-related goals. And we do have equity-related goals that are part of our state plan. We submit a state plan every 5 years to the state. You see some of the equity goals that we have around identification, delivery of services, professional development, and equitable representation of students. These are all in the current version of our state plan that the board approves every 5 years, which we file with the state. And you can see that for the identification factors, we're looking to increase our use of multiple methods of identification using advanced academic curriculum with more students and looking to include more criteria in our screening process, just as one example of an equity goal. Next, I wanted to briefly describe the continuum of services in our model, because again, I think people in the community sometimes we focus a lot on level 4 services, but we actually have, of course, 4 levels of service at the elementary and the middle school. And that first level of service really all students get, which is access to critical and creative thinking strategies used in our classrooms. Level 2 services really look at differentiation, and you can see what that means and looks like at the elementary level. And at the middle school, the opportunity for students to take honors courses in a particular area of interest and ability. Level 3 services are part-time services that students get at the elementary. That could be push-in services, it could be pull-out services. And at the middle school level, students can choose to take additional honors or advanced classes. And then, of course, I think most people are familiar with the full-time level 4 services. At the elementary level, you can access that in a center or at some of our local level 4 schools. And at the middle school, that's 4 honors classes in all 4 core subjects. Briefly, I wanted to mention the Young Scholars model, which is really our model to identify students that have potential and develop that potential. And we're really looking at those historically underrepresented student populations when we're identifying young scholars. And we look to identify that potential when we're comparing those students to students of a similar age, experience, and background. And the Young Scholars model provides them with additional supports and opportunities, enrichment programs, summer school programming. And we currently have the Young Scholars program in 87 of our 141 elementary schools, which is clearly a long way to go in terms of getting to 100% complete implementation. So the Young Scholars model is promoting equity, and we'll look at some of the data on that in some of our slides subsequently here, but it's not in all of our schools, so we still have an equity gap there. This is the data of our current level 2, 3, and 4 services that really illustrates what our equity gaps are. And I do need to go through this a little bit more slowly because it's important that everybody understands how to read this chart. So what the chart is representing on the first row is level 4 students in grades 3 through 8 that have been found formally eligible. So they've gone through the identification process and they've been found formally eligible by the school system. And in the columns across the chart, you see what percentage of students in that particular subgroup have been found formally eligible. So when you look at all of the students in grades 3 through 8 that have been found formally eligible, it's 19%. Corresponding across the chart, you can see the various percentages for different subgroups. One distinction that I want to call your attention to is for English language learners on this chart. So looking at the percentage of students that are formally eligible for English language learners, levels 1 through 5, that means students that are currently receiving English language development support. Only 1% of those students have been found formally eligible. Those students are distinguished by the next column, English language learners, that includes students that were former English language learners and have now developed English language proficiency. And when you include those students, that percentage does go up. FRM, of course, is free and reduced meals, and SWD is students with disabilities. And we can break that information out and disaggregate it even more, as Ms. Schultz referenced in an earlier work session today, but we weren't able to do it today, but we could do that as a next step. Now, if you look at the additional rows on this chart, I want to distinguish those from the top row. So the rows that are shaded in light gray, the first one is level 4, eligible, school designated, and students that are taking 4H, 4 honors classes in middle school. So this is including all the students that have been found formally eligible and students that may be receiving services that have been pushed into services or self-selecting to take 4 honors classes. So that percentage is higher, yet it's distinct from the level 4 eligible row above it. The next row are those level 3 students that we just talked about that might be getting part-time services, and the level 2 students that would be getting differentiation services, and students taking between 1 and 3 honors classes in middle school. If you take all 3 of the gray rows and you add those up, you get the total percentages at the bottom. Okay, so that top row is distinct from the rows below it, and the 3 gray rows total to the final row. So here you can see that we have, and the board knows this, we have some persistent equity gaps in terms of student representation across the subgroups. We're quite a long ways from parity still. So this is the equity issue that we're trying to address. So just a few pieces of background information on some of our recent equity efforts. Again, I'm not going to, in the interest of time, go through everything on this chart, but one thing to call your attention to, just going back about 5 years, in 2013-14, we did fund centrally advanced academic resource teachers in 13 of our Title I schools. And half of that time is dedicated to really working with our young scholars and strengthening that model. So that's been one of the things that the board has talked about, and there were some possible budget amendments to add more advanced academic resource teachers in future budgets. So I'm not going to go through all of these ongoing equity efforts in the interest of time, but I'm happy to come back to them and talk about them in more detail. On this slide, you can see some of the examples of success based on some of those equity efforts. And the first is we have increased the number and percentage of referrals for Black and Hispanic students over the last essentially 8 years. And that work has really been through teacher advocacy and having our advanced academic resource teachers be responsible for referring young scholars and other students that they are seeing potential in. So not waiting for the family to do it, not waiting for another advocate to do it, but doing it ourselves. And you see that we've increased the number and percentage of both Black and Hispanic students as a result. The second bullet there talks about the number of eligible Black and Hispanic students then actually being admitted to the program after they had been referred, so actually being found eligible. So you see again, just using the increase in Hispanic students, for example, from 403 eligible students to 1,699 students being found eligible. And then down at the bottom is some information on how our young scholars are doing once they actually get to high school. So of those students that have been formally identified as young scholars and getting enrichment services and support, about 80% of those students are taking advanced classes, even though they aren't formally eligible for level 4, but 80% of those students taking advanced classes in middle and high school, and then about 80% of those students earning A's and B's in those classes. Okay, we're coming to the home stretch here. The other thing that the forum had asked us to provide some information on is some of the recommendations recently provided by advisory committees. So again, we didn't go back in time all that far, but going back about 2 to 3 years on some of these, you can see that a lot of the recommendations that we've received from advisory committees have been implemented. Some have been partially implemented. But looking at what's not been implemented, you can see for quite some time we've had some advocacy to fully fund full-time advanced academic resource teachers in our schools. And in this particular year, our Advanced Academic Program Advisory Committee was suggesting that ARTs actually spend more time coaching in the general education classrooms as a way to get greater equity of access to curriculum and help us to identify some of those historically underserved student populations. Again, APAC gave us some recommendations last year around fidelity of implementation, specifically of the young scholars model. And again, you can see a number of things we were able to implement, but again, not implemented included staffing each elementary school with a full-time advanced academic resource teacher and each middle school with a half-time advanced academic resource teacher. In 2017, MSAOC looked at equity issues in AAP in some detail, and I'm the superintendent's representative to that group, and I was involved in supporting them and looking at this issue, and they had given us some very good recommendations around promoting the young scholars model and providing more funding for young scholars. Some of that we've been able to do, again, with limited funding. But they also ask us to develop more of an accountability mechanism to monitor some of our program goals related to equity, and we've been able to do that actually, I think, with the new AAP metrics in the strategic plan. So that's something that I think we should be proud of. And then additionally, they encouraged us to establish an Office of Minority Student Achievement. And again, I think that the establishment of the Office of Equity is another example where the school board should be very proud of their work. So finally, and most importantly, what we want to talk about is the scope and the timeline for an external program review. So this again is just the consensus from the school board forum. And on the last slide in this presentation, what I've done is taken that forum request and tried to put it into essentially an estimated timeline and some possible activities that we would want to make sure would be included in our contract with an external consultant. So, first of all, we would say by winter 2019 or spring 2020, we would ask a consultant to deliver a report to the school board that would include these things. So the first thing is recommendations for specific actions and proposed timelines to eliminate those opportunity, access, and achievement gaps for all of our subgroups in AAP level 4 in grades 3 through 8. Additionally, we'd ask for the report to include a synthesis and analysis of research-based best practices, current FCPS program practices and enrollment data, and feedback around our identification practices from stakeholder groups. And we've labeled a number of possible stakeholder groups, and I know Ms. Hines had some additional stakeholder groups that she had suggested that we would add, so we can talk about that here in just a second as well. And then the third bullet is requesting that the consultant deliver any interim recommendations that could be developed as early as possible, particularly if they might inform the FY21 budget. And then lastly, I am recommending that the immersion programs be conducted separately and concurrently if possible, meaning approximately on the same time frame. And the reason I'm doing that and the reason I'm recommending the timeline of winter 2019 and spring 2020 is that Ms. Maloney has actually already supported me in reaching out to some experts in the field and starting to get a sense if they might have the capacity to do this type of work and how long it would take. And the two biggest pieces of feedback that we got is the amount of work that we're requesting with respect to stakeholder engagement and when we would begin such a process, which would be no earlier than this spring, because we have to go through the procurement process, not just in our institution, but in whatever institution that they work for will take some time. And it's very unlikely to get stakeholder engagement done prior to the summer. And you don't want to do stakeholder engagement during the summer because you miss families that are gone for vacation. So they're suggesting that probably the earliest we could get this done might be the end of 2019, but probably more likely the beginning of 2020. But we won't know for sure until we engage a particular consultant and begin contractual negotiations. Additionally, the other piece of feedback they gave us was that doing immersion at the same time probably would be good in terms of stakeholder engagement, but we want to get an external consultant who has expertise in the field. And when we were talking to folks that had expertise in gifted education, they said, well, you know, we could do magnet, we could do immersion, but we're not necessarily probably the best situated experts to do that work. You might want to think about engaging another consultant for that work. So that's really all I had for the presentation. We went through it kind of quickly. You still have about 30 minutes. And what I really was hoping that we would accomplish is revising this last slide to include any content that you want done that's not represented on this slide. And again, the next step would be for me to work with the Office of Procurement Services to develop essentially an outline or a draft contract that you could review again before we move forward.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Presidio. I have 3 people on my list so far. Ms. Hines, Ms. Schultz, and Ms. Strauss. Is there anyone else? Okay. Evans, Corbett Sanders.
Okay, let's start.
Okay, let's start with Ms. Hines.
Thank you. All right, thank you very much for this work. This is a great way to frame the conversation. I really appreciate it. A couple things that I sent around, and then I was going to just add something else. The board, and I asked in my email, you know, could the board approve of the outside expert before the work begins. And if you're sending this through procurement, that's probably not the best way to do it. So I think what I would like to see there is maybe that we take a look at the description of who you're looking for, because I think the amount of independence from FCPS staff is important. So that's the only thing that I would suggest, is that we make sure when we describe the consultant we're looking for, it be someone who is independent of FCPS staff. And, I'm going back to the study we did a few years ago where, the people who did it were very friendly with the person who was heading up the gifted, the AAP office. And so that, we want to make sure we have some distance there, I think. So the other thing that I sent around is just to add some, and I'm happy to, I don't know if everybody hasn't looked at it, I sent it in an email last night. Just adding folks to the list of people who, on that bullet that talks about input from stakeholder groups. I would add not only students identified for AAP, but also students not identified for AAP. I would add advisory groups, ACSD, SHAC, HRAC, Student Advisory Committee, the Superintendent's Teacher Advisory Committee, FEA, FCFT. I would add to the FCPS principals and teachers a representative sample from AAP and non-AAP buildings and classrooms, and then that we guarantee anonymity for particularly teachers who request it. And then also, I think for the FCPS Instructional Services Department, a representative sample from the AAP office and other instructional services departments. And the reason for all of that, I think, is that when we are looking at this to tell how equitable we are, how well we are spreading this to every classroom, to every kid, and with what fidelity, I think it's really important that we ask these questions of people who are not identified. What is the experience for the kid? I mean, look at level one. Level one is supposed to be available with fidelity in every classroom. And we can't know whether that's true unless we're talking to teachers and students and parents who are not in level 3 and 4 classrooms, right? Or have not been identified. So that's why I would just throw the sample wide open to make sure, because the equity question has to include everybody. So the last thing I would say, and this is a question for Dr. Presidio, can you connect this study with our new strategic goal measure, which says that that AAP curriculum is available with fidelity in every classroom every day, the new measure that we added, right? That says, it will be everywhere. Will we make...
Ms. Hines, I'm sorry. You just hit your 3 minutes. Do you
Okay.
want to try to wrap that up?
Yes, I will.
Thank
Will
you.
we make that part of the task for the outside expert to report to the school board on how best to do and measure that, to make sure that it's available in every classroom every day? We're going to add that goal into the report.
So we certainly can do that at the pleasure of the board. The one thing that I would say is the more things that we add in, obviously, the longer it will take. So you'll have to weigh that against the urgency of the timeline around this, which is why we were suggesting that any interim recommendations that the consultant would deliver to inform the budget be delivered. So, but we certainly could add that in as well. And I had your other edits, but I didn't have that one. So hopefully our clerks captured that last one.
Okay, next we have Ms. Schultz. Thank you.
Okay, so at the beginning you said that one of the possibilities, and I didn't understand if you're saying that state law is self-referral for a student to AAP. Could you, I'll get my questions out, so I make my 3 minutes. So I don't understand what that means, self-referral, if you could describe that. On students with disabilities, on that chart, is that a self-contained number, and that those numbers are not represented in the other subgroups, like the student profile page of each school used to be, where I asked that the students with disabilities be pulled out, and that was a separate standalone number, but then each grade still had its correct, count. ELL, you added in that second column 1 through 10. Why doesn't it just say 6 through 10? The percentage of the population, I think, is important, because you just have the percentages compared to each other as opposed to a percentage of the whole. So the N. And then what is the outcome of achievement in the schools that have had the AARTs, do we need to explore curriculum rigor versus, everybody clamoring to get their children into AAP? Do we have a curriculum rigor problem? And if so, should we be addressing that? Eligible versus participate. Eligible is interesting, but I don't know what that means. That's like, the number of people who take an AAP class versus, or an advanced placement class versus pass it. Eligible doesn't mean anything. How many are participating and how many are retained? That's particularly important to me with regards to students with disabilities, because quite often they quote unquote qualify and then they get booted out. And that's a fluency problem, because quite often advanced academics is volume, 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 and speed. And the kids may be able to do it, but can they do it at, is there a fluency issue? And then on the advisors question in terms of who to survey or who to include, do we have any way to access either graduates of the system or maybe people who left because they felt that their needs weren't being met, so that we have perspective of people who have been in the system and are out either by graduation or by default leaving. And I left 14 seconds on the table.
Okay, very good. So I counted 7 questions. I think a couple of them we could possibly put in the study. A couple of them we could answer now briefly. So I'm going to watch the clock, and I'm going to ask Ms. Maloney to briefly describe the self-referral process.
The self-referrals was last time the regulations were changed for gifted ed. They added in that they wanted referrals to be able to come from anybody who knew the student. And prior to that, it had been just a parent. So they added in it could be a coach, a professional, anyone who worked with the student, including the student themselves. And we do have a small number of students who submit referrals for AAP services in Fairfax. Mm-hmm. Correct.
But are those students who don't have a cognizant parent? I mean, how would a student self-refer without their parents?
So the parents are always notified before it would go forward, but they may say, hey, I'm interested in that. And so the advanced academic resource teacher would say, if you want to write down, what you would be interested in about that, they would then contact the parent.
That could be important, particularly for students that are English language learners and their parents might not have the language fluency to be able to complete the paperwork, so things like that.
I'm just concerned about parental rights.
Right, which is why, definitely the parents are involved in the notification process. But we're just trying to make it as equitable as possible for the students. So you had several questions on the chart. The first was around students with disabilities. Students with disabilities, that's 6%, for example. Well, let me use the 5% on the top row. That's 5% of all of the students with disabilities in grades 3 through 8. So you were asking about, what that number represented, if any particular students were pulled out. So for any of these subcategories, you could get a student that has fits in multiple subcategories.
But what I'm saying is, like, when it says, 12% Black or 7% Hispanic, does that 12% include the students who have disabilities and the 5% is the separate whole? Or is the 5% pulled out?
You're comparing, in each of those, you're comparing the percent to the whole of that subgroup. So that's why I'm saying kids could be in multiple groups. So you could have a student with disabilities in that 5% who's showing up, and they're also showing up somewhere else on the chart. So we could get more information, obviously, and break it down in more detail. Again, this work session was not to try to get into that level of depth of analysis. It was to provide enough background, hopefully, to help the board determine what you want additional analysis on, particularly from the external consultant. So in that regard, some of the other questions that you asked around outcome versus achievement, the level of curriculum rigor that we have in general, the eligibility versus participation, and I'm having a hard time reading some of my own
1
notes
through
here.
10 versus 6 through 10.
Yeah, so let me go back to that. So again, we could divide that differently. If you just wanted to do 1 through 5 and 6 through 10, we definitely could do that on the chart. But some of the other questions you asked, I think, might lend themselves to things that you might consider getting an external consultant's perspective on. I'd be happy to follow up on any of those things as a next step, but you might want to put a couple of those things in the scope of services.
I think
too.
percentage of the population, the raw numbers, what's the end is crucial. I mean, it's always what's the number and what's the percentage.
Right.
I mean, I say that every work session.
So we'd be happy to do that, and some of your other questions, think about whether or not you'd want me to take those as next steps or put those in the external review. Thank you.
Thank you.
Sorry, I'm going really fast. 'Cause I
No,
know
you're doing well. Ms. Strauss?
I'm sorry, can you just say anything? Do we have any access to graduates to get their perspective?
I think we could ask for that. I think it'll be tricky, but we could try. Yeah.
Ms. Strauss?
Sometimes we get, I'm sorry, just one. Sometimes we get students that come back for celebrations like IB diploma celebrations that have participated. They'll come back right after graduation. So sometimes we've got access, but it's limited.
I think that just gives the student voice. I think that part is important.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, first of all, slide 17 is very impressive in showing the gains. Right. Okay, thank you. And I'm also pleased that you're thinking of looking at the immersion program separately from my AP, because I think they're two different programs with different outcomes, and if we want dual language learning, we need to figure out where we're going with that. And I'm assuming you would include both two-way immersion and then immersion programs beyond a school's boundary. Is that right?
I think so. I mean, again, this is an area where I think what we need to do is kind of flesh out exactly what the board might want included, what we would say perhaps the best thinking and the best approach would be, and again, draft that up and allow the board to review it and edit it before we take it to market.
I think that's a separate question. It's
Yeah,
separate than
I definitely think we'd want to look at the different types of immersion programs we have, though.
Right. And then I'm assuming that your RFP, this will be a competitive bid?
I think it would have to be.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes, I think so.
Yeah.
Okay, all right, great, thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Strauss. We have Ms. Evans.
Thank you. I have basically two questions. I'm assuming that this will go heavily into best practices for low-income students. That's understood. That I really would like a good answer on that, what the barriers are, as well as students with high mobility. That's an area where we don't focus, but I've got to think that students who move around a lot for whatever reasons it may be harder to identify those students just because of continuity. So that is one thing that I would be interested in having some data on that. And my only other question is about current funding. With the AARTs, I see on slide 16, we currently have 13. Is that correct? If you go to slide 13, that we currently have 13 Title I schools that get one full-time equivalent?
It gets central staffing for that, yes.
And is that all the central staffing for AARTs, just at those 13 schools?
For full-time advanced academic resource teachers.
Okay.
We had put together some cost estimates as part of the budget amendment process.
Yes.
And we could include those and send those out again where we had costed if we, how much would it cost if we put full-time advanced academic resource teachers in all Title I schools, all elementary and middle.
Right. I would appreciate that. But I would also, as a next step here, would like a rundown on what is centrally funded, what's currently centrally funded. So if somebody has a base school level 4, is that centrally funded, or do they have to find that from their own budget?
Go ahead.
So each elementary school is funded with a 0.5 AART, and then there are a number of schools that will either use Title I funds or trade positions to have a full-time. Having a level 4 does not get an extra AART position.
So let me just make sure I've got this right. Every elementary school gets a half an AART, no matter whether they're Title I or not.
Correct.
So, but these 13 Title I schools get a full-time equivalent, and then if a principal wants to have a level 4, he or she has to piece that together, and still just gets the 0.5.
Well, remember the level 4
Okay.
though is servicing level 4 students, and the advanced academic resource teacher is really on top of that to promote the central screening process, which Kirsten just got done completing last week, screening thousands of files, right? To provide level 2 services, to provide level 3 services, to work with the CTs in the building to support them in their curriculum development. So if you have a local level 4 program, you're getting your full-time teacher for those level 4 classes. The advanced academic resource teacher is not in those classes in a center or in a local level 4 providing direct instruction all the time.
And so I would like to see the list of the 13 schools that have it now, and if it's not lost to history, how those 13 were chosen versus others. Thank you.
Ms. Corbett Sanders?
Yes, thank you. Appreciate this. I'm glad to hear it's going to be competitively bid. So I don't think that we really have a role in choosing who the consultant is. I think you all will do that well as long as you have as part of your RFP process the independence factor that Ms. Hines suggested. I think that's great. I am a little concerned about which groups we have identified as advisory groups to be consulted. We have mostly organizations that have formal relationships with Fairfax County public schools, and then we get to the NAACP, which I think is an important group to consult, but I also think that if we're going to go down that route, we also have to include NACASAC, CASA, some of the other organizations. So, and I understand every time we add more, then we're broadening it. So we either have to have a comprehensive list, or have some sort our advisory groups plus outside organizations that we then have a couple of engagement sessions with. But I don't know how we choose which one. So I would just make sure that we're comprehensive in how we approach that. And then additionally, I do want to raise the issue. I was a little surprised to hear about the immersion programs. I'm glad you're going to look at them because they do have an impact, frankly, on the earlier conversation we had today about facilities as well. And but I thought that when Ms. Keys-Gamarra brought this to the forum topic, that the immersion programs had been dropped out of it.
So, I'm sorry, continue.
So I would just, I'm glad to see that we're looking at them. I have no problem with them being separated out, given that Ms. Keys-Gamarra's forum topic. Lastly, what's not in here is the funding model of per pupil funding. So in the program budget, we actually give per pupil funding based on what level a child has been identified for or the services they're receiving. So there is a disparity in funding depending on the school that a child is attending. And so I would urge that that funding subsidy also be looked at as part of this study and how that impacts positive outcomes.
All right. Thank you very much. Sorry to jump the gun there for a second. Just going backwards on a couple of the questions. On immersion, I did just want to make sure that everybody understood that that was part of the board consensus after the forum. So I think you're correct about what was originally submitted, but this was the consensus as it was developed at the forum itself. So if we didn't want to, or I should say if the board didn't want to include immersion at this time, we certainly could take it out. But that was why I was suggesting doing it on a concurrent basis and timeline. Again, on the per pupil funding, we certainly could add that into the scope of study as well. We do have kind of per pupil funding for other subgroups. So for ESOL students, there's a per pupil funding. For students with disabilities, there's a per pupil funding. So a lot of our subgroups, there's similar per pupil funding ratios. That's definitely something that could be included in the study. And then your first question was really around which groups to include. That's where we're really hoping to get good guidance from the board. One possibility would be for us to, as you said, kind of bifurcate the formal advisory committees that we have a relationship with and make sure that we really do discrete, perhaps outreach with them, and then invite other community groups to come in at the same time that might be part of some additional outreach. So that could be one methodology for doing
I do
that.
think we have to do the additional outreach because, frankly, all of us get a lot of input from the individual advisory groups that we consult and our own appointees to it. So I would err on the side of broadening it, but I just don't want us to only narrowly broaden it to make it look like we're only concerned about certain groups. And so, for example, like SEPTA wasn't listed up here, but
Right.
probably should be.
So again, I think that would be great. And again, we can take the feedback that we've gotten from the additional groups and put that together in a draft and circulate that for the board to review. I was just suggesting we might be able to expedite that by not having to go to every group individually, we might be able to take those outside groups and invite them into 1 or 2 sessions, and they could, they could be part of a larger process, which could, help expedite the completion of the report. So.
And that's the type of decision that you'd want your consultant to be able to come back and say, this is the best way of making it happen.
That's right.
Thank you, Ms. Derenek Kofax.
Yes, I do want to again focus on page 17 about how when we changed, the referral process and how that worked and the success that we have. And I know we're still not where we need to be, but I do think part of the reason for the advocacy some of us have had for the additional academic resource teachers is because they actually teach teachers the strategies on how to identify students. And that's why it's so important when we look at those numbers and how they've changed. The only number I have in my head is for 16 AARTs, which would be to add to the Title I students, that would have been $1.6 million. I think I don't have the exact number, but in order to fund an advanced academic resource teacher at all of our schools at this time, I think we didn't have enough funds, or it was going to take up the totality of our funds, which we didn't have identified yet. I think it was going to be somewhere up to $6 million.
That's correct.
Is that correct? Okay. So that was from my head. I was hoping I was right. I agree with maybe having subsets of the formal advisory committees versus others, and as this session is truncated today, maybe we can all kind of come to consensus on that at the next one. And I did miss the last work session where we talked about it. Can you give me a little brief history about? I'm not exactly sure how immersion came to be part of it, and I'm not still exactly sure your advocacy as staff. You think that's good or not? Because I wasn't here for the discussion.
So I can do my best. I might ask Ms. Hines to weigh in on this one as well, because my understanding is that when the original advocacy was developed, that I think it might have been Ms. Hines who was interested in adding the immersion component. I can't remember for sure. It looks like it might have been Ms. Corbett Sanders. So you all need to help me with that. But I know that originally there was some interest in that. Ultimately, I think it was removed from Ms. Keys-Gamarra's forum request topic, but then the discussion at the forum, my understanding, then yielded what is represented on this consensus slide. And I have to tell you, I'm not the best one to give that background information because I actually was not in that particular forum session. So that's just my understanding of what happened there. So I would invite anybody else on the board, if you have a different understanding, to share that.
At the end of that session, it was not a part of what we had, but I'm not exactly sure how it got added.
Sure.
So.
And I think at the end of the day, the board just needs to decide, is that something that's a priority to do now, or is that something you'd like to wait on and do later?
Okay, just without having the opportunity. I was there for your forum topic, and I know it wasn't part of it. I hear now, and I'm not exactly sure. I'm not exactly sure I'm convinced that it's a good thing at this point. So I need to get some more information. I think the AAP curriculum is one thing, and the immersion programs are another. They're administrated differently. They're people are identified differently. There's not immersion. It's a whole different ballgame. So I'm not exactly sure, but I will talk to my colleagues offline and try to get a better consensus from, or better understanding from them. So when you're looking for consensus, I can be better informed.
Thank you.
And I think we can squeeze in one more, Mr. Moon.
Okay, thank you so much.
After him.
Just one point of clarification, very minor point. Number of schools offering young scholars is, I saw 87 on one of your slides and 88 in strategic plan for 3-year baseline. So hopefully one of those numbers will be correct?
Well, I think, unfortunately, the correct number is 87. So
87.
Now we've got to get one more in place before next year at a minimum.
Okay, all right. Oh, well, until because I was going to get to a target by school year 20, that number is supposed to go up to 106,
Yes.
and then subsequently by 24, all 141 schools. Is that simply funding issues?
mostly funding issues. The two cost drivers there to really accelerate the implementation of that program and provide services, the best way to do it is with a full-time advanced academic resource teacher.
I see.
The additional costs are for the enrichment activities, summer school programs for students, curriculum materials for those students, and those types of expenses.
This may be a budget question, but from 88 to 141, that's about 53 schools. How much money are we talking about?
I think I'd probably need to cost that for
Okay,
you. and I'll
would
give
you
an
would you
estimate.
would you cost that
Yeah,
out?
we can do that as the next step.
And do you believe the Young Scholars is something that will benefit schools, elementary schools, no matter which district the schools may be in, which community the schools may be in?
I think that it would. I do think, obviously our thinking on this has been when we have limited funds to prioritize the schools where you have the highest number and highest percentages of historically underrepresented students, which is why we started with the 13 particular Title I schools when we had limited funding to do so.
But there may be schools which are not necessarily underrepresented,
Right.
but they will still benefit from Young Scholars, you think?
Absolutely.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, Ms. Palchuk.
Yes, thank you. Thank you for this presentation. I guess I have two very small points. The first one around immersion, and I don't remember the conversation. I know that I've looked at the numbers, and they are even less representative of our diverse community than our AAP numbers. So I guess I'm okay with looking at it separately. The question would be, in this study, I know we have maybe less than a handful of our AAP schools, local level 4 or centers that also provide two-way immersion, but there are some schools. So for me, it would be really important to be able to see if there's an impact when both programs are available to students, if there is a way to kind of try to see, disaggregate a school that has AAP and some kind of immersion versus none. So I guess my hope is that can be included in there. And then the other one, I think I heard some of the people Ms. Hines recommended to be included on that list. The one I don't know if it was mentioned, while you have the Office of Equity, I think it would be important to include our equity leads because they are on the ground in our schools. So to try to find a way that perhaps geographically and by type of school, we have representation from those staff members who are on the ground and trying to address our equity issues. Thank you.
Okay, I think I'm going to make just a couple of, that's all I have on my list.
Well, no, I'm the meeting manager with you, and we always go last, so
Well,
I'm supposed to be on the list. Yeah.
That's what I was about to say. Okay. Well, Mr. Wilson, we have exactly about 2 minutes before the hard stop. So,
Okay, well, I'm glad the meeting managers go last. So the question I have initially is on page 3 of the handout. This is slide 6. I'd like to at least have sort of a high-level explanation of, I think, the who demonstrate high levels of accomplishment. That makes sense. The second piece of that you highlighted in red, I really would like to have that fleshed out more for me and for the board, because I think when we're talking about the achievement gap, I think you're thinking about reaching out to students who maybe haven't demonstrated the high level of accomplishment. So I think that's an important thing for us to understand. And then the other question I had really had to do with the students with disabilities. I'd like to understand that population. Is that the twice exceptional children for the most part, and what percentage of that is twice exceptional? And what percentage of it is just children who maybe aren't twice exceptional, but they're incorporated into classes that are part of the AAP, or, level 1 or level 2 or level 3 programs?
In the interest of time, I'm not going to try to respond to those right now.
I think we're waiting for a second person for a closed-door meeting. I was just informed, so if you want to go ahead and answer, go ahead.
Do you want to answer something?
So with twice exceptional students, it can be difficult because they mask in either way. So you'll have students who have AAP and they may have a learning disability, but they don't formally have a 504 or an IAP. So they may not be captured in that data set. And likewise, the flip also happens where you might have a student who is identified for special education, but they don't have a formal identification for gifted also. So that's a difficult number to capture, not just in Fairfax, but nationwide. Anything you read on Twice Exceptional will talk about that. But that number there is representing students who have been formally identified for AP and have an IAP. And a 504.
Okay, so I think we've had one go through for most everyone, so I'd like to go ahead and take a turn. I'll start with the initial. I know we started by saying we had the consensus language. I'm not exactly sure how we reached that, and I know that there were a number of subcategories in the original one that was submitted, including 2E students. And so I don't know whether we have that I didn't see it as a part of our presentation. So I wanted to mention that. I certainly would like for my colleagues to be reminded of where we started. I'm a little unclear as to how we reached the consensus or how a couple of things were added. With respect to funding the AARTs, I think that Ms. Derenak Kofax addressed it. But certainly want to look at the effectiveness of that and how much a difference that has made. I know that on page 10, there was a recommendation to connect with the CPC College Partnership Program. I know at one point I was in this meeting and I was told that that program no longer existed. I later found out that it does. So I would love to see some numbers with respect to how we're actually, I know that was one of the programs that was in my son's schools, but what are the numbers of participation there, and would certainly love to see whether that could be a further enhancement to these efforts at the high school level. For me, I really am looking for, I'm just one board member, but I'm really looking for ways to concentrate on those elementary years and looking for recommendations as to how that can happen. I think if we expose children at that age, then it increases the possibilities as they get older. I'm wondering if we also need an education, a component for parents. I know that, okay, so certainly I hear that has been recommended by others, and certainly would like to look at to see if that needs to be, or how that could be incorporated here. And let's see. And I'm wondering if, with respect to getting a good sampling of these additional groups, perhaps that is something as well that the consultant can say, well, you know, given what's offered to us, I don't know if adding all these groups is, you know, another component that adds on to the timeline, or whether we can just talk to the consultant to try to figure out what would be best to get a good sampling of our community. But I am concerned about being able to get something more immediately, even those interim recommendations, and then perhaps some longer term recommendations. Those were my comments.
And I'll just let you know that we're ready to start closed whenever you finish.
Okay, I appreciate that. The first thing I wanted to ask staff to respond to all of us, because I think it's a process question, is that we did compress this into 1 hour, and we know we're trying to work towards finalizing what this is going to be, because it's not until then that staff can then develop and put out the request for proposal, the RFP. So I think from a housekeeping perspective, we'll need to understand what that's going to entail, and that will help our chair and vice chair determine how quickly to get this second portion of the AAP work session scheduled. The second thing is I wanted to reinforce what Ms. Keys-Gamarra said. I think that the focus on the K-6 AAP delivery model is where we're having the most amount of concern that we're hearing out of the community. By 7th and 8th grade, as Ms. Keys-Gamarra noted, we've lost a pretty big window for kids, especially accessing advanced math courses by then. The other thing is, I do think that we're going to need to be thinking about, and Sloan, I believe you were here when we did the George Mason study, a key distinction about how Fairfax County's AAP program has evolved over time is that it went from being highly gifted to standard deviations above the norm for delivery of center-based level 4 instruction, to then we went to domain-specific giftedness. And so what that essentially meant was some students may be gifted in one of the 4 areas of academic study, but we were still identifying them as level 4, going to a center. And so I do want some clarity. It doesn't have to be today, but I do think that before we go launch, a new consultant and a new study, is to understand how has Fairfax County then, what are we looking at today as our delivery model, and will that be something that at minimum the consultant looks at and says, from a best practice approach, and then also thinking about the fact that we spend over $1 million a year transporting students to centers. We're creating overcrowding in the host schools. We're having communities be upset that their base population in the neighborhood schools feel that they are becoming the smaller portion of the population. It no longer feels like their neighborhood schools. So I just think that those are things, as we talk about the board's desire to close opportunity gaps, I want to make sure that what we're not doing is just trying to take an older model and just continue to keep trying to make this older model work, but instead saying, if we continue with a 21st century approach to advanced academic instruction, what does that look like, and how might that impact our delivery, if that makes sense? I think everybody supports wanting to have robust and exceptional advanced academic opportunities for kids, but I just don't want us to be working from a model that isn't necessarily a 21st century approach.
Okay.
If I could just go back, I think SEPTA absolutely, because of the complications with students with disabilities, and not all the 5%, they're not all twice exceptional.
Right.
They could have, so that is I don't want to say non-negotiable, but I feel like it's a non-negotiable ad.
I would agree with you, Ms. Schultz. I have some concerns when we start expanding more extensively, and then I'm concerned. I'd like at least some feedback from staff as to how that impacts what we're trying to do here. But can I just ask if we have a general consensus in terms of, I'm wondering if we need to see the next steps or not.
Can I ask a question? Yeah.
So I guess-
I'd just like to know, if we're going to continue, that means that staff will not move forward on the RFP until we have another chance to talk. Is that right?
Well, I was about to pose that question, because I think we have some time constraints that Mr. Presidio is concerned about. Is that correct?
Yeah.
Question I asked, and it didn't get answered.
Oh, you asked him? Oh, okay, go ahead. Did you want to answer?
We'll know how soon to get this, yeah.
You need,
What's your optimal that we have our follow-up work sessions so get you moving?
Well, I think
actually, Ms. McLaughlin, I think it's a different question. The first question is there enough here for Mr. Presidio to be, are we comfortable, having given our input in the past hour, to allow Mr. Presidio to move forward with drafting an RFP and beginning the process of hiring a consultant? And if we are, then we should vote on that tonight. If not, then we have to schedule a truncated work session in the future. That's really the two questions.
I actually think we have another option, and that is that they write up what they think they can from what we have, and possibly in that next work session, that would be a part of what we consider. Why are you making that?
I'm just not a big fan of wordsmithing RFPs.
I don't want to wordsmith it either, but I'm just giving folks another option.
As the other meeting manager, and this was something that we talked about in the meeting preparation, Ms. Corbett Sanders, my concern is you have to have a scoped RFP. And unless the board is really clear right now at this very moment that everything we're going to be, I don't know how we can just green light Mr. Presidio from today to go ahead and develop it and move forward.
So I know you're under time constraints, and it's really difficult. I guess the way that I was thinking about this is kind of similar to what Ms. Corbett Sanders was saying. If the board is comfortable and there's consensus about all the things that you suggested that we add into this scope, that I work with staff, our staff and instructional services, and try to at least draft an outline of what we think the scope is now. We could circulate that to the board for additional input. And once we have consensus on what that outline is, then we'd start the RFP process with procurement services. But it's really important to me that the board has a full understanding, as Ms. McLaughlin is saying, of what specifically the scope of services are, because I'm really not interested in starting a process this important without the full board's agreement about what it is that we're studying. And if that means that we have to go a little bit slower, then I think we probably need to go a little bit slower. But I do think I can take the input that we received today and at least, if nothing else, start an outline that we could circulate and share with everybody for the board to look at and say, did we miss anything, or did something else occur to us that we want to add in?
I just wanted to say, I think a major decision that needs to be made is whether or not we're going to just do AAP, or if we're going to include the immersion piece in the research, because that was what you were suggesting would be staff is suggesting that we have, yes, that we bifurcate that. And I don't know if there's true consensus of that around the table, or if that's a decision that could be made today.
Can you just confirm for me that we can include any impact of immersion on the AAP programming if we bifurcate it? That's my only concern.
I mean, we certainly would request that.
Right.
So.
There are a couple of AAP level 4 programs in immersion programs. I think that's what we want to make sure that that's taken into account.
Who is comfortable with bifurcating the immersion at this point? Taking it out. Okay. All right. And then I think Ms. Hines had a comment.
Well, I was just going to say, I think the idea of coming back to us with a draft is a good idea. I think, though, obviously we can't, as individual board members, then, you know, send Dr. Presidio or Dr. Brabrand an email and say, change it this way or change it that way. I think we're still going to have to come together and talk about it as a board.
I think that's what's on the table, is that he would write up, Dr. Presidio would write up something for us. We would get an opportunity to review it, and then we can give a go-ahead as to, you know, give some feedback as to whether we agree. If we don't agree, then we need to meet again. Is that okay?
The only thing I just want to remind everybody, that's definitely okay, but the timeline is going to be pushed back, obviously, the longer it takes to finalize the scope and finalize the RFP, so.
So at this point, I'd like to ask the board if they are comfortable with Dr. Presidio at least writing up a draft for us to consider and going from there. Yes?
What do you mean by going from there?
What I just said. In other words,
Discuss the draft.
you either determine whether you agree. If you don't agree with it, we have to meet again. But at this point, I'd like for him to at least get a draft for us to consider.
So if
I'm going to make a
one
suggestion, a
board-
little
yeah.
slightly nuanced. Have Dr. Presidio go ahead and start putting together a draft RFP. The vice chair and I, working with the superintendent and the clerk, will work to get a very short, no more than an hour session on one of our future future but close in future work session, so that we can just finalize this. But I'd like to be able to at least optimize the period of time between now and that work session by having Dr. Presidio working on an RFP.
Okay, who can agree to that? All right, we're good.
Thank you, everyone.
Okay.
We're
Well,
going
I
into
have
closed
had that
session.
done. So now I'd like to, the board will now make a motion to go into closed meeting to discuss and consider personnel matters, specifically the assignment, performance, and/or disciplining of a specific public officers and specific public employees pursuant to Section